Some stories begin in the broad daylight of hope, but this one started shrouded in the heavy, gray fog of an early Texas morning, the kind of fog that blurs the line between what's lost and what might still be found. On the outskirts of Cielo Verde, a town so small the local diner doubled as the post office, and half the folks knew what you'd eaten for breakfast before you finished your coffee, Grace Turner was already awake, boots crunching on the frost-bitten grass outside her battered ranch house. She was a woman folks called tough as nails, but in the privacy of sunrise, with her late husband's flannel wrapped tight around her, Grace felt more brittle than strong. It had only been a year since cancer took Tom, and 6 months since the accident that stole her only son, Michael. Some days getting out of bed was the hardest thing she did. But habit, stubbornness, or maybe just survival, had her feeding chickens and checking the fences before most people's alarms ever rang. That morning, as she poured cracked corn into the old tin pan, a sharp, frantic sound pierced the quiet, a clattering of hooves, wild and desperate, echoing off the road at the edge of her land. Grace straightened, heart in her throat, squinting through the mist. There, just past the rusty mailbox, a small reddish-brown blur darted out of the fog and collapsed beside the ditch. For a moment, it didn't move. The cars kept passing, drivers more concerned with making it to the refinery on time than stopping for another stray. One trucker, idling at the shoulder, rolled down his window and called out, "Don't waste your time, ma'am. That one's finished." He shook his head with the certainty of someone who'd seen plenty of things die out here. But Grace had never cared much for the judgment of others. Maybe it was pride, maybe just a bone-deep loneliness that made her walk toward the foal instead of turning away. Up close, the sight twisted something inside her. This foal wasn't just thin, it was skeletal. Every rib and hip bone jutting sharp as knives through its mud-caked hide. The animal trembled, each breath a shallow gasp. Its eyes, wide, wild, edged with pain, met Grace's for a second before flickering closed. For a heartbeat, it looked just like her son had in those final moments at the hospital, fighting for air, for another chance. Grace didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees in the mud, heedless of her jeans or the chill. "Hey now, sweetheart. I got you, okay?" Her voice, rough from too many cigarettes and too many nights crying alone, softened to a whisper. The foal twitched. Grace stroked its neck, feeling the heat of fever under her palm. "You're not alone now. Not if I can help it." She glanced over her shoulder. The trucker was gone. The world felt very far away. Logic screamed to call animal control, to let nature run its course. But Grace was tired of listening to logic. Town gossip would start before noon, she knew it. There goes Grace Turner, wasting what little she's got on another lost cause. But she'd lived through worse than whispers. With a grunt and no small effort, she hoisted the foal into her arms. It was lighter than she'd expected, bones and skin and almost nothing in between. She staggered to her old Chevy, yanked open the passenger door, and slid the foal onto a nest of feed sacks and horse blankets. The ride home was silent, save for the foal's rasping breaths and the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers fighting mist. Grace talked to fill the emptiness, telling the animal about her ranch, about Tom's laugh and Michael's wild ideas, about the chickens that refused to lay, and the stubborn old mare who'd bitten every vet for 50 miles. The foal didn't respond, but Grace kept talking anyway. At the ranch, she parked close to the barn, shouldered open the door, and eased the foal out. It shivered, head lolling, legs too weak to hold its own weight. Grace bundled it in every spare blanket she could find, fingers clumsy with urgency. She lit a lantern and set it nearby for warmth, murmuring encouragement as she checked for wounds, for ticks, for anything she could treat. Her own hands shook with adrenaline and fear. She'd barely finished when the neighbor's voice cut through the quiet. Ed Malone, tall and stooped and perpetually suspicious of anything that didn't moo or lay eggs, stood at the fence line, arms crossed. "Grace, what are you doing? You can't save every lost cause, you know." His tone was gentler than his words, but there was warning in it too, a reminder of all the things she'd already lost. Grace met his gaze, chin up. "Maybe not," she said, "but I can try." Ed shook his head, muttering about fools and miracles, but Grace ignored him. She turned back to the foal, who was barely breathing now, eyes rolling back, and she wondered if maybe this was another piece of herself she'd lose before the week was out. Still, as the sun struggled to burn off the fog and a cold wind rattled the barn door, she refused to give up. She stroked the foal's face, determined, fierce, a whisper of hope blooming in her chest. "Hold on," she begged, more to herself than to the trembling creature. "Just hold on one more night." The sky brightened to a pale, uncertain blue. Grace sat by the foal's side, watching every breath, every twitch, refusing to let sleep claim her. The world outside spun on, indifferent, but in that small barn, hope and heartbreak tangled together. And for the first time in months, Grace wondered if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Cliffhanger. As the wind howled and the foal's breathing grew ragged, Grace glanced at the clock. Almost sunrise. Would this fragile life survive the night? Or would the world prove once again that some souls were just meant to be lost? Only time, and Grace's resolve, would tell. The Texas sky darkened early that evening, swallowing the last traces of fog in a heavy blue-black hush. A bitter wind clawed at the barn doors and sent restless flurries of dust spinning across the yard. Inside, the only glow came from a battered old lantern, its light shivering in rhythm with the storm outside, casting long shadows that twisted and merged among the rafters. Grace Turner, face lined with fatigue, was a sentinel by the foal's side. She'd given the animal a name, Star, because of the faint white patch on her forehead, like a single hope burning in a sky full of sorrow. She watched over Star with a stubbornness that bordered on desperation. Every instinct screamed at her that this little life, barely begun, was slipping away with every rattling breath. She wrapped Star in every blanket she owned, her late husband's old army quilt, Michael's childhood comforter, even her favorite threadbare shawl, layer upon layer, determined to fight the cold that crept in through the barn's warped planks. The foal shivered violently, and Grace could feel the fever radiating through the blankets, with the outside temperature plummeting and the wind screaming like a banshee. The barn felt less like a shelter and more like the last outpost before defeat. Each hour, Grace fought exhaustion, refusing to let herself close her eyes for more than a minute at a time. She spoon-fed Star small amounts of milk mixed with honey and salt, her hands trembling from worry and lack of sleep. She stroked the foal's neck, whispered encouragement, and sang the old lullabies she used to sing to Michael, her voice breaking now and then as memories pressed in. "Hush now, little darling. Close your eyes and dream. Mama's right here. Nothing's as bad as it seems." She would have laughed at herself if she had any energy left. Singing to a dying foal on a night like this. Maybe the town gossips were right. Maybe she really was losing her grip. But Grace clung to the ritual, using it to hold back the loneliness gnawing at her chest. Midnight came and went. The storm worsened, sleet rattling against the barn roof like thrown gravel. Grace kept her vigil, eyes gritty, nerves on edge. Star's breathing slowed, each gasp thinner than the last. At 2 in the morning, the foal stopped moving entirely. For one agonizing minute, Grace feared she was too late. But Star twitched, a feeble movement, and the relief nearly buckled Grace's knees. At 3 a.m., just as the lantern threatened to sputter out, Star's breathing faltered again. This time it was worse. The foal's head lolled back, tongue slipping from her mouth, her entire body racked by a sudden shudder. Grace's heart clenched. She cradled Star's head in her lap, hot tears streaming down her cheeks. "No, please, baby, not now. Stay with me, please." She was crying so hard she didn't hear the crunch of gravel outside or the footsteps splashing through puddles. It wasn't until the barn door creaked open, sending a gust of freezing air swirling in, that she looked up. Dr. Carla Jimenez, the local large animal vet, stood framed in the doorway, hair soaked, glasses fogged. She took in the scene with a single glance. The dying foal, Grace on her knees, blankets everywhere. "Grace," Dr. Jimenez said softly, kneeling beside her. "You should have called me sooner." "I didn't know if she'd make it through the night," Grace replied, her voice hoarse. "Didn't want to get my hopes up." Carla gently examined Star, her practiced hands checking the foal's pulse, lips, and gums. Her frown deepened with every second. Finally, she looked at Grace and shook her head. "Her heart's weak. Fever's high. She's badly dehydrated, malnourished. It's a miracle she lasted this long." "Don't get your hopes up, Grace. Sometimes, even with the best care, nature has its own plans." The words hit like a punch, but Grace set her jaw. "I know what the odds are, but if there's a chance, I have to try. Please, Carla." The vet sighed, pulling out an IV bag and setting up fluids. She injected antibiotics and painkillers, her hands efficient but her expression guarded. "I'll do what I can, but if she goes, you need to understand. It's not your fault." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She held Star tighter, her tears soaking into the foal's coarse mane. "You hear that, baby? You gotta fight. I'll fight with you till my last breath if I have to, but you gotta meet me halfway." For the next hour, Grace and Dr. Jimenez worked side by side, warming towels in the microwave, massaging Star's legs to encourage circulation, coaxing sips of water between tremors. Time lost meaning, measured only by the foal's fragile heartbeat and the howling wind outside. Occasionally, Grace would doze for a moment, only to jerk awake, terrified she'd missed the moment Star needed her most. Just before dawn, as the black sky began to pale at the edges, something changed. Star twitched, then shifted her head, nostrils flaring. Her eyes opened, glassy but alive, and she made a weak, searching sound. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She squeezed the foal's neck gently, murmuring encouragement. "That's it, Star. Stay with me. Stay." Dr. Jimenez checked the foal again, her expression unreadable. "She's not out of the woods. But that's the first good sign I've seen all night. Sometimes these little ones have more fight than we give them credit for." The vet packed up, fatigue carved deep into her face. "I'll check on her this afternoon. In the meantime, keep her warm, keep the fluids going. And Grace, don't make any promises you can't keep, to her or to yourself." Grace nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. As the barn door closed and the storm began to ease, she looked down at Star, still weak, still trembling, but alive. "If you want to live," Grace whispered fiercely, "I'll fight with you until my last breath. That's a promise I can keep." And with that vow hanging in the hush of the barn, as the first rays of dawn finally broke through the clouds, the long night of reckoning came to an end. But the fight for Star's life, and for Grace's own battered heart, was only just beginning. Dawn in Texas has a way of sneaking up on you, golden and shy, casting light on the battered world and making even the rough edges look softer, if only for a moment. That morning, as the sunlight filtered through the barn's dusty windows, Grace Turner woke on a bed of straw, stiff and aching, with her hand resting on the narrow neck of a foal that had no business still being alive. The exhaustion sat heavy in her bones, but for the first time in ages, she felt something besides sorrow, a tiny ember of hope, stubborn as weeds growing through concrete. Star was alive, but only just. Her breath came in shallow pulls, ribs fluttering beneath the thin skin. But there was a clarity in her eyes now that hadn't been there the night before. She watched Grace with a wary intensity, not quite trust, not quite fear, a look Grace recognized from stray dogs and wounded hearts alike. Grace smiled, gentle and steady, even as tears stung her eyes. "Hey there, Trouble. You're not giving up on me, are you?" The foal's ear twitched. For a moment, Grace let herself believe in small miracles. The days that followed blurred into a slow, grueling rhythm of care and caution. Grace nursed Star hour by hour, wound by wound, breath by breath, refusing to let the fragile creature slip back into the darkness she'd come from. The outside world receded. Chores went unfinished, phone calls unanswered. Even the hens clucked in protest at their late breakfast. But Grace barely noticed. Her universe had shrunk to the small circle of straw and lamplight, where a battle for life played out in whispers and sighs. She read aloud to Star in the afternoons, her voice trembling but determined. Sometimes she chose Tom's favorite westerns, the old leather-bound books that still carried his scent. Other times, she reached for poetry or battered paperbacks Michael had loved as a boy. The words filled the barn, chasing away the silence, giving comfort to them both. Star would flick an ear or shift her head, listening, eyes slowly blinking, as if remembering some distant, peaceful place. Grace noticed the way her hand steadied as she read, the way her heart hurt less when she spoke the words aloud. At night, when the wind pressed hard against the boards and loneliness howled just beyond the lamplight, Grace would curl up in the straw beside Star, her hand always touching warm, living fur. Sometimes her dreams brought back the hospital corridors, the beeping machines, the sound of her son's laughter fading into static. Other times, she'd wake to the sound of Star's breathing, fragile but steady, and remember where she was, and why she had to keep fighting. She would run her fingers through the foal's mane, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "I won't let you go, not if I can help it, not again, not this time." Every small victory felt enormous. The first day Star accepted a full bottle without protest. The first time she nickered softly at Grace's approach. The tentative way she nuzzled the feed bucket, lips quivering, unsure but curious. Each of these moments sent a jolt through Grace. Pride, relief, and a growing sense of connection she hadn't dared hope for. She began to talk more, not just to Star but to herself, filling the barn with stories about Tom's stubbornness, Michael's wild dreams, and the hundreds of little things she missed about life before everything changed. But there were setbacks, too. Some mornings, Star wouldn't eat, her sides heaving with pain, eyes dull and distant. Grace's stomach would twist with dread, and she'd call Dr. Jimenez, her voice tight with panic. The vet always answered, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes between calls to other farms. She'd talk Grace through the latest scare, offer advice and reassurance, and remind her that healing wasn't a straight line. It was 2 steps forward, 1 step back, every day a gamble. Some nights, after Grace finally managed to drift off, she'd wake to the sound of Star struggling, her legs thrashing in the straw, breath harsh and ragged. Grace would leap up, heart pounding, and wrap her arms around the foal's neck, soothing her with gentle words and the rhythm of her hand. They'd sit together in the dark, breathing in time, both trying to convince themselves that tomorrow would be better. As winter melted into spring, a subtle shift took place. Star's coat thickened, her legs grew stronger, and the haunted look in her eyes began to fade. One chilly morning, as Grace finished reading from Tom's favorite novel, Star lifted her head and nudged Grace's palm with a cold, velvet nose. The touch was so soft, so tentative, that for a moment Grace thought she'd imagined it. But Star did it again. Once, twice, then let her head fall back into the straw, content. Grace pressed her lips together, blinking back tears that threatened to fall. That tiny gesture, that first spark of trust, meant more than any words could say. Word of the foal's slow recovery started to spread, carried on the wind and by the mouths of curious neighbors. Some called to check in, others left bales of hay by the gate, but Grace mostly kept to herself, wary of hope and too wrapped up in the fragile bond forming between her and Star. She knew people were talking about the crazy widow with the dying foal, about the line between grief and madness, but she didn't care. Every day Star fought was a day Grace didn't have to face her own losses alone. There were moments of quiet beauty, too. Late in the evening, when the light slanted gold through the barn and the dust danced in the air, Grace would sit with Star and talk about the future, about running in green pastures, about winning blue ribbons, about the chance for a new beginning. She didn't know if any of it would come true, but the act of speaking it aloud made it feel possible. Spring brought rain and the sweet scent of wildflowers drifting on the breeze. The pastures turned green, the air filled with birdsong. And one bright morning, as a new day spilled gold over the hills, Star lifted her head, looked Grace straight in the eyes, and let out a soft, contented sigh. Grace reached out, and Star pressed her nose into Grace's palm, a promise silent and sure that neither of them would have to face the world alone. In that barn, amid the scent of straw and the hum of distant thunder, a fragile bond was forged, one breath at a time, one hard-won moment of trust after another. It was more than survival. It was the beginning of something neither Grace nor Star had dared dream was possible, a second chance. Spring crept slowly across the Texas plains, brushing the land with new grass and wildflowers, coaxing life from winter's hard grip. On Grace Turner's small ranch, the world felt changed, softer somehow, even as uncertainty still haunted every shadow. The barn, once a place of sorrow and sleepless nights, had become the center of Grace's universe, pulsing with the quiet heartbeat of hope. It was in these gentle mornings, with sunlight slanting through the gaps in the barn walls and dew sparkling on the pastures, that Star tried her first steps. It didn't happen all at once. Grace would coax her, voice gentle but firm. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's see what you've got in those legs." Star would shift, tremble, struggle to get her feet beneath her. Sometimes she'd make it halfway up, only to collapse, legs buckling, body quaking from the effort. The first few times Grace's heart shattered with each fall, and Star's eyes would fill with confusion, as if she couldn't understand why her body refused to obey. But Grace had been through enough heartache to know that sometimes you had to celebrate the try, not just the triumph. She knelt beside Star, wiped dust and tears from the foal's coat, and whispered, "You did good, little girl. We'll try again tomorrow." She remembered Michael's first steps in their old living room, Tom's laughter echoing in her ears, and the way hope always seemed to flicker back, even after 1,000 failures. In that barn, every wobble, every fall, was a kind of victory. The rhythm of recovery was slow, each day shaped by small routines and setbacks. Star grew braver, attempting to stand on her own when Grace wasn't looking, though her legs shook with every effort. Grace's friends began stopping by more often, bringing coffee and gossip, trying to coax her out of her self-imposed exile. Some meant well, their words wrapped in concern, but the warnings cut deep. "Grace, you're getting too attached," one friend sighed, balancing a mug on the fence rail. "Sometimes love just isn't enough to save what's broken." Another neighbor, Mrs. Halpern, pressed her hand over Grace's, voice soft. "You're a good woman, Grace, but be careful. It hurts more when you let yourself hope." Even Ed Malone, who'd always been more bark than bite, tried to soften his caution. "You can't save everything, Grace. I just don't want to see you get hurt again." Grace listened, but she didn't let the doubt sink in. Instead, she poured all her energy into Star's recovery. In the quiet, private moments at dusk, she confessed her truth to the little foal. "Saving you is saving me, too. You might not understand it, but that's how it feels. We're both still here, right?" The barn felt like a confessional, her voice a lifeline tossed into the dark, hope echoing back in the hush between breaths. Sometimes, after another failed attempt to stand, Star would lay her head on Grace's knee and sigh, a soft sound that vibrated right through Grace's chest. Those moments stitched Grace's frayed edges together, if only for a little while. Outside the barn, life in Cielo Verde kept moving. Spring brought more rain than usual, swelling the creeks and painting the fields with wild bluebonnets. The town's annual livestock show approached, and for the first time in months, Grace considered rejoining the world. She thought of entering Star in the recovery class, a special event for rescued or rehabilitated animals. The idea felt both daring and reckless, but the notion lingered, stoking her stubborn streak. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and painted the barn with streaks of gold, Star tried again. Grace had cleared a patch of straw, making sure nothing would trip her. "You ready, little one?" she asked. Star's ears flicked in response. Grace steadied her hands under Star's chest and belly, giving a gentle push. The foal braced, legs trembling. This time something was different. A flicker of resolve, a memory of every story Grace had told, every song she'd sung. Star heaved herself upright, legs shaking like saplings in a storm. She stood, quivering, for a single heartbeat before toppling sideways. But when Grace hurried to her side, Star didn't look scared. She looked determined. They tried again, and again. On the fifth attempt, Star found her footing, wobbly but upright. She stood, sides heaving, sweat beading under her thin coat. And then, just as the light faded, she took 3 wobbly, beautiful steps toward Grace. Grace let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "That's it, Star. You did it, sweetheart." She dropped to her knees, laughter and tears mingling as she stroked the foal's neck. For a moment, every loss, every sleepless night, every whispered warning from friends, all of it faded away. Hope, small and stubborn, had bloomed right there in the barn. Later that night, when the town was quiet and the stars blinked overhead, Grace sat by the paddock fence, Star curled at her feet. She looked up at the sky, the vastness of it, and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, love could be enough to pull 2 broken souls back from the edge. But shadows lingered. Grace knew the world wasn't suddenly safe just because Star had taken a few shaky steps. The town's skepticism hadn't disappeared, The pain of loss still haunted the quiet moments. Some nights, Grace lay awake, watching Star sleep, her mind spinning with worry. Would the foal relapse? Would another illness strike? Would she find herself alone again with nothing but memories? Still, she chose to hope, chose to believe that healing was possible, that heartbreak wasn't the end of the story. As spring deepened and the barn filled with the scent of hay and wildflowers, Grace and Star carried each other forward, one wobbly step at a time, their bond as fragile and fierce as new life. And outside, the world turned on, unaware of the small miracle unfolding inside that battered barn. Two survivors learning how to walk through sorrow and into the light. The Cielo Verde annual livestock show was more than just a rural tradition. It was a parade of pride, competition, and the stubborn pulse of community. For weeks before the event, the town buzzed with excitement. Fences were painted, barns were swept clean, and rumors swirled about which rancher might finally unseat Linda Harlow's prize bull as best in show. For Grace Turner, just thinking about attending sent a cold ripple down her spine. It had been years since she'd walked those fairgrounds, not since Tom's laughter had mingled with Michael's shouts near the corn dog stand, both of them alive and whole. Now, the memories pressed close, painful, bittersweet, and impossible to ignore. Yet here she was, standing in the pale morning sun, holding Star's lead rope, her stomach churning with a cocktail of nerves and determination. Entering the recovery class with Star wasn't just about showing a horse. It was about telling the town, and maybe herself, that loss didn't have to mean the end of everything. She spent days preparing, brushing Star's coat until it shone, practicing gentle walks around the paddock, and whispering reassurances to a foal who was still half wild, still learning how to trust. The day of the show arrived warm and blustery, the sky streaked with the promise of summer. The fairgrounds were already alive by the time Grace and Star arrived, kids running wild, vendors hawking barbecue, the air thick with the scent of hay and sweat. Every face seemed to turn as Grace led Star past the main gate, some with surprise, others with a flicker of doubt. The foal was still small, her reddish coat more scruffy than sleek, but she walked tall beside Grace, ears perked, eyes wide with wonder and anxiety. "Isn't that the Turner widow?" someone whispered near the ticket booth. "She's brought that sickly foal," said another, half curious, half scornful. Grace heard every word but kept her gaze fixed ahead, her jaw set. She reminded herself that this was about Star, not about the ghosts she carried. Star glanced back at her, nostrils flaring, as if seeking assurance. Grace patted her neck. "You're braver than you know," she murmured. The show ring was a circus of noise and color. When their turn came, Grace took a breath, led Star into the ring, and tried to block out the judging stares. At first, Star seemed steady, taking measured steps and blinking in the sunlight. But then the crowd pressed closer, a dog barked nearby, and the buzz of the PA system crackled through the air. Star tensed, muscles coiling under her skin. Grace whispered, "Easy, girl. You've got this." Suddenly, a loud burst of laughter broke out from a group near the rail. Star shied sideways, her hooves slipping on the sawdust, and then, before Grace could steady her, she collapsed, legs folding beneath her in a clumsy heap. The ring went silent, the kind of hush that's almost cruel. Grace dropped to her knees, stroking Star's neck, ignoring the way her cheeks burned. Tears threatened, but she bit them back, focusing on Star's trembling breath. From the stands, a familiar voice rang out, sharp and mocking. Linda Harlow, immaculate as always in her crisp white shirt and boots, leaned over the fence. "Some things never change, Turner. Still rescuing losers, I see." Laughter followed, brittle and mean, and Grace felt every eye in the crowd on her. Anger flared in her chest, but she kept her voice low, only for Star to hear. "They don't know you, sweetheart. They don't know what you've survived." She pressed her forehead to the foals, blocking out the world for just a moment. A gentle hand settled on her shoulder. It was Mrs. Halpern, her neighbor, offering a tight smile. "Don't let them get to you, Grace. Courage is always quietest when the world's the loudest." The kindness steadied Grace, who nodded, gathering her strength. The judge, a stern-faced man with a gray mustache and kind eyes, approached. He knelt beside Star, examining her with careful hands. "She's scared, that's all. Let's give her a minute." He motioned for the crowd to give them space, and slowly, the noise faded. Backstage, Star was still shaken, but Grace refused to give up. She brushed sawdust from Star's coat and whispered encouragement. "We're not here to win a ribbon. We're here to show what hope looks like." She didn't notice the little girl crying nearby until Star, curious and gentle, stepped over and nudged her hand. The girl gasped, startled, then smiled through her tears and stroked Star's soft muzzle. Others gathered around, first hesitant, then bold, children drawn to Star's quiet resilience. The skeptical judge watched from a distance, noting the change in the crowd. He knelt beside the girl and Star, asking questions, and Grace realized he was really listening. Not just to her, but to Star's story, written in scars and trust. When the class ended, there was no blue ribbon for Grace and Star, but something more important had happened. Grace saw it in the way the judge lingered, in the hush that replaced laughter, and in the warmth of strangers who now saw her foal not as a lost cause, but as a survivor. Even Linda Harlow, who had ruled the show ring for years, seemed smaller now, her words echoing hollow in the new respect swirling around Grace and Star. Later, as dusk settled over the fairgrounds, Grace led Star out to the trailer, her heart full. She looked back at the crowd, at the children waving, at the judge who gave her a nod of real approval. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. She felt seen. In the truck, as Star dozed beside her, Grace allowed herself a shaky laugh. "You did good, girl. You showed them what second chances look like." She thought of Tom and Michael, imagined their voices in the wind, and smiled through her tears, but beneath the triumph, a quiet fear lingered. Star's collapse had been more than just nerves. Grace couldn't shake the worry that something deeper was wrong, a shadow she would have to face soon enough. For tonight, though, she let herself believe in the miracle she'd carried into the ring, a miracle written not in blue ribbons, but in every scar, every gentle nudge, every brave, trembling step. The applause and commotion of the livestock show faded into memory, replaced by quiet days at the ranch. But Grace couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her chest. At first, she blamed Star's exhaustion on the stress of the show. So many strangers, all that noise and travel. But as the week wore on, Star's spark began to dim. She grew listless, her eyes losing their bright edge. She picked at her food, shied from the other horses, and spent long hours standing motionless in the corner of her stall. Grace hovered over her, worry etched deep in her features. She measured Star's temperature, feverish. She changed her water, mixed medicine into her feed, and sang all the old lullabies, desperate to push back the shadow settling over them. At night, she lay awake listening to Star's breathing, willing it to remain steady and strong. Some nights, the fear felt so sharp it stole her breath. The vet, Dr. Jimenez, visited again, her face grave. "She's fighting an infection," she explained, checking Star's pulse and gums. "It's not uncommon after everything she's been through." Her immune system is fragile. But Grace, treatment won't be cheap. You'll need antibiotics, fluids, more rest. It's going to be a hard road. Grace nodded, jaw tight, her gaze never leaving the foal. She'd given up so much already. Time, sleep, her standing in the community. Now, as she mentally calculated what little money she had left, she realized she was nearing the edge. The ranch wasn't prosperous. The last year had drained what savings Tom had left. But quitting wasn't an option. Not now. Not after all they'd survived together. That night, as she pored over old boxes in her bedroom, Grace pulled out a dusty chest filled with family heirlooms, her mother's wedding ring, Tom's pocket watch, Michael's first rodeo belt buckle. She ran her fingers over each object, the memories thick and bittersweet. She hated the thought of parting with these pieces of her history, but she loved Star more. In the morning, she called the local pawn shop, her voice barely steady. "What'll you give me for a gold ring and an old silver watch?" she asked, swallowing her pride. The answer was less than she hoped for, but enough for the vet's next visit and a round of medicine. The sacrifices wore on her. Even the animals on the ranch sensed something was wrong. The old mare Sugar paced restlessly in her paddock, while the barn cats curled up close, silent witnesses to Grace's struggle. As if the universe sensed her burden, trouble came from another direction. One evening, just as Grace was finishing up in the barn, she heard the crunch of gravel and the familiar rumble of a pickup. She looked up to see Matt Turner, her late husband's brother, climbing out, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Matt hadn't set foot on the ranch since Tom's funeral. He was taller than Tom, but with none of his warmth, a man who viewed the world through the cold lens of practicality. He glanced around, eyes lingering on the sagging fence lines and the worn-down barn, before fixing Grace with a hard stare. "You look tired, Grace." She didn't reply, focusing instead on brushing Star's tangled mane. Matt stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You can't keep this up. You're running yourself into the ground for a lost cause. Tom wouldn't have wanted you to go bankrupt over a sickly foal. Sell the ranch, move to town, start over." Grace bristled, the words stinging like a slap. "This ranch is all I have left, Matt. And Star, she's part of this place now." Matt shook his head. "You're chasing ghosts, Grace. Sometimes you have to know when to let go." She met his gaze, unflinching. "You don't get to decide what I fight for. Not now, not ever." He left without another word, the tension hanging heavy in the dusk. Grace stood in the yard, fists clenched, fighting back tears. The ranch was more than land and fences. It was memory, love, and every moment she'd ever shared with Tom and Michael. Letting go would be like erasing her own existence. Inside, she knelt by Star's stall, head bowed. The foal was weaker than ever, breathing shallow, her coat dull. Grace stroked her gently and looked up at the night sky through a crack in the roof, searching for a sign. "Just one more miracle," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. "Just one more and I'll never ask again." That night, sleep came only in fits and starts. Grace dreamed of Michael's laughter, Tom's arms around her, and the sound of hooves thundering through the fields, so real she could almost feel the earth shake. When she woke, the world felt empty, the silence pressing in from all sides. The next morning brought a surprise, one that would shift the course of everything. As she collected the mail, expecting only bills and reminders of what she owed, Grace found a small, unmarked envelope tucked between the usual letters. Inside was a folded note. "For Star, don't give up." Tucked within was a wad of cash, not a fortune, but enough for another round of antibiotics, some extra hay, and a little left over for groceries. There was no signature, no hint of the sender's identity. Grace stared at the money, tears streaming down her face. Someone in town had noticed. Someone was rooting for her and Star, even if they were too proud to admit it out loud. The anonymous gift brought hope and a new kind of pressure. Grace realized she wasn't fighting just for herself and Star anymore. Others were watching. Others were quietly hoping she might succeed, might prove that compassion and stubbornness could still change the world, even if only a little at a time. With fresh resolve, she called Dr. Jimenez and scheduled another visit. She bought the medicine, bought fresh feed, and even managed a smile when the old mare nickered at her from across the yard. That night, as the sun sank behind the hills, Grace stood in the barn, watching over Star. The fight was far from over. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, she felt something like faith, a belief that maybe, just maybe, miracles weren't just for storybooks. She pressed her forehead to Star's and whispered, "We're not done, you and me. Not yet." The foal nickered softly in reply, eyes shining with a hint of her old spirit. Together, in the golden hush of twilight, they faced the darkness, not alone, but bound by hope, grit, and the promise of one more day. The Texas spring was always unpredictable, but that year it seemed more fierce, as if the weather itself was determined to test the limits of what could survive. The air grew thick and heavy as the week dragged on, clouds massing in angry columns over the low hills that ringed Grace Turner's ranch. Neighbors talked of flash floods, of storms that could sweep away whole years of work in a single night. Even the animals seemed nervous, clustered together under the wide oaks as the sky grew dark long before sunset. Grace felt the pressure in her bones, that ancient warning passed down from her mother and her mother's mother, a sense that something was coming, and it wouldn't be gentle. She hurried through her chores, checking the roof of the barn, throwing extra hay into the stalls, filling every bucket she owned with water in case the power went out. Star was quiet that evening, her coat slick with sweat despite the cooling air, her big eyes following Grace's every move. Grace tried to act calm, humming softly as she worked, but her hands shook as she latched the barn door and listened to the wind building outside. By dusk, the first hard drops began to fall, pattering on the tin roof like impatient fingers. Lightning slashed across the horizon, and thunder rolled so close it rattled the old windows in the ranch house. The power flickered, went out, came back, then failed for good, leaving the house and barn wrapped in a restless, humming darkness. Grace grabbed her lantern, heart pounding, and headed back out into the storm. The wind howled around her, tugging at her jacket and pelting her face with sheets of rain. Branches whipped overhead, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the crack and crash of a tree coming down. But she pressed on, boots squelching in the mud, every instinct screaming that she had to reach Star before the worst of it hit. Inside the barn, the air was thick with fear. The other horses stamped and whinnied, eyes wild, but Star stood rigid in her stall, ears pinned back, body shivering. Grace set the lantern on a hook and stroked the foal's neck, whispering, "It's just a storm, sweetheart. Just a little rain. We'll ride it out together." She checked the latches, made sure the doors were braced, and tried to quiet her own nerves. But the storm had other plans. A sudden blast of wind tore a loose plank from the barn wall, sending a spray of rain and debris across the stalls. The horses screamed, surging against their gates. Grace's heart slammed in her chest as she rushed to calm them, her voice nearly lost in the roar. In the confusion, Star panicked, bucking against the stall door until it burst open. In a flash of lightning, Grace saw her bolt out into the darkness, a reddish blur vanishing into the chaos outside. For one paralyzing second, Grace couldn't breathe. The fear was primal, absolute. She shoved open the barn door and plunged into the storm, calling Star's name into the blackness, her voice raw and desperate. The rain blinded her, filling her boots and soaking her hair. But she kept running, stumbling through mauve-tad and tangled weeds, following the faint impression of hooves. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the pasture in stark, unnatural colors. Grace caught a glimpse of Star near the creek, wild-eyed and struggling against the rising water. The storm had turned the gentle stream into a churning river, swollen and dangerous. Star slipped, hooves scrambling on the muddy bank, and tumbled into the water with a terrified cry. "Star!" Grace screamed, sliding down the embankment, branches whipping her face and arms. The creek was deeper than she'd ever seen it, the current swift and deadly. But there was no time to think, only to act. She waded in, boots sucked off by the muck, cold water dragging at her clothes. The current nearly knocked her down, but she forced her way forward, driven by pure adrenaline and terror. Star was flailing, head barely above water, the panic in her eyes mirrored in Grace's own. Without hesitation, Grace grabbed the foal's mane, using every ounce of strength to haul her toward the bank. The world shrank to pain and effort. The water was freezing, and the mud pulled at her legs like quicksand. Her arms burned, muscles screaming, but she refused to let go. Star kicked and thrashed, nearly dragging Grace under more than once. "Come on, baby, come on, you can do it," she gasped, not sure if she was talking to Star or herself. A branch swept past, smacking Grace in the shoulder, but she barely noticed. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged Star closer to the shallows. The foal, sensing the bank, finally began to kick with purpose, finding her footing, driven by instinct and the sound of Grace's voice. Together, battered and soaked, they staggered up the muddy slope and collapsed on the high ground, the storm still raging overhead. For several minutes, Grace lay there gasping, rain washing the blood and mud from her hands. She pressed her forehead to Star's heaving side, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. The foal's heart hammered wildly, but she was alive. Against all odds, she was alive. As the storm raged on, Grace knew they had to get back to shelter. She coaxed Star to her feet, half carrying, half guiding her across the pasture, the ground slick and treacherous. Lightning struck a fence post nearby, sending sparks skittering, but they kept moving, one shaky step at a time. Back in the barn, Grace collapsed beside Star in the straw, shivering uncontrollably. She wrapped the foal in dry blankets, ignoring her own cuts and bruises. Around them, the wind began to die, thunder fading into the distance. The worst had passed. Grace cradled Star's head, whispering over and over, "You did it. You made it. You're safe." She wept openly, no longer caring who saw, her tears washing away the last of her fear. In the hush that followed the storm, she realized just how close she'd come to losing the only piece of her heart she had left. The barn was battered, the fences down, but Star was alive, and so was she. In the darkness, Grace found her resolve renewed, forged in the crucible of the storm. She had risked everything for this foal, and in return, Star had fought to stay by her side. The storm outside had passed, but inside the barn, another kind of storm was quieting, a storm of grief and loss and loneliness, replaced by the fierce, stubborn hope that had carried them through the night. As Grace finally drifted into a restless sleep, one hand resting on Star's flank, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, no matter what storms the world tried to throw their way. When morning came, the world outside Grace's battered barn had been transformed. The land glistened, washed clean by the storm, every puddle reflecting the pale Texas sky. Fences were bent, trees were stripped, and the fields wore deep scars of mud and broken branches, but the ranch still stood. Inside the barn, Star lay curled in a nest of fresh straw, sides rising and falling with slow, exhausted breaths. Grace, slumped beside her with hair still damp from the night's ordeal, felt every muscle ache, every bruise earned. But they had survived. That alone was a kind of miracle. By noon, word of what had happened began to trickle through Cielo Verde, carried on the lips of neighbors and the wind itself. Stories of Grace braving the raging flood, saving the sickly foal against all odds, spread quickly. The ranch, long avoided by most except for gossip, became the quiet center of the town's attention. Grace worked through the day, cleaning up storm damage as best she could, but she kept returning to Star, offering sips of water and gentle encouragement. Star was still weak, shaking on her feet, wary of sudden noises, but she stood by Grace at the rebuilt fence that afternoon, her coat gleaming faintly in the sunlight. The image of woman and foal, both worn but unbroken, drew people from the town like moths to a lantern. It started with the kids. They came first, peeking shyly through the open gate, hands behind their backs, giggling and whispering. Grace watched them, a tired smile on her lips. One brave boy held out an apple, red and shiny, and Star took it from his palm with trembling gentleness. The others followed, feeding carrots, brushing soft noses, laughing when Star's lips tickled their fingers. Grace let them come close, seeing in their eyes the wonder she'd felt herself, the quiet awe that comes from witnessing something come back from the edge. The children's parents followed, bringing with them offers of help, bales of hay, fence posts, a thermos of hot coffee, even a pie. These were the same people who'd doubted her, who'd whispered about her in the aisles of the grocery store. But seeing Star alive, witnessing her resilience and Grace's devotion, seemed to thaw old prejudices. The skepticism faded, replaced by pride that something like this could happen in their little corner of Texas. Linda Harlow came last, stepping quietly from her truck as dusk crept across the yard. She looked different. No crisp show clothes, no air of superiority, just a tired woman with regret in her eyes. She approached Grace, hands in her pockets, pausing at the fence. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Linda cleared her throat. "Grace, I wanted to say, I was wrong about you, about all of this. If you need help with hay or anything, just ask." She glanced down, shuffling her boot in the dirt, then looked up. "You showed us what real grit looks like." Grace nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you, Linda. It means more than you know." Word continued to spread. By sundown, half the town had stopped by the ranch or called to check in, and the kitchen table was piled with casseroles, tools, and envelopes of cash. Gifts from people who, days ago, would have crossed the street rather than talked to her. But it wasn't the food or money that mattered most. It was the laughter of children, the sound of hammers and saws as men rebuilt the fence, the quiet moments when women stood by Star, stroking her neck and whispering gentle words. Star, still weak, stood tall beside Grace, eyes alert, ears flicking as if savoring the new sounds of hope. She accepted every touch, every treat, her gentle manner winning over even the town's most skeptical hearts. For the first time since the accident, Grace felt something inside her mend, a wound, slowly healing, with every handshake and every offer of help. The new sense of community was more than Grace had ever dared hope for. It wasn't flashy or perfect. People still argued, fences still needed mending, and the scars of old hurts didn't vanish overnight. But there was a new warmth, a sense that perhaps no one had to face their storms alone. Even the old ranch dogs picked up on the change, wagging their tails and weaving between legs as if to welcome the newcomers. As evening deepened, the yard filled with neighbors sharing food, stories, and laughter. Someone started a fire in the old pit, and soon the smell of roasting meat drifted across the fields. Children played tag beneath the oak trees. Star watched from her paddock, and Grace sat on the porch steps, exhausted but content. Linda Harlow joined her, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think being tough meant never letting anyone see you struggle, but I think you taught me something different. It takes more strength to ask for help, and even more to accept it." Grace nodded, looking out over the gathering. "I spent so long trying to do everything myself. I think I forgot how much people want to help, if you let them." For a while they sat in silence, watching the sky turn from gold to violet, the first stars blinking above the barn. Grace thought of Tom, of Michael, of all the lonely nights spent wishing for one more chance to believe in people. Now, she realized, that chance had come. Not as a single grand gesture, but as 100 small kindnesses, offered and received. After dinner, the townsfolk drifted home, leaving behind the echoes of their laughter and the promise of returning tomorrow to help with more repairs. Grace walked out to Star, stroking her neck. "You did it, girl," she whispered, pressing her cheek against soft fur. "You brought them back to me." Star nickered, leaning into the touch, her eyes reflecting the last light of day. For the first time in years, Grace didn't feel alone. The community's help had turned skepticism into pride, loneliness into belonging. The ranch, once silent and empty, now pulsed with new life, a living testament to the stubborn hope that, in the end, we are all stronger together. The camera of memory lingered on that scene. A tired woman and her rescued foal, surrounded by the gentle buzz of neighbors and the fading light. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, not of grief, but of gratitude. She whispered a quiet thank you to the night, to her lost loved ones, to every hand that had reached out when she needed it most. As darkness settled and the first chorus of crickets began, Grace knew that whatever tomorrow brought, she and Star would face it together, supported not just by each other, but by a town that had learned, at last, to open its arms. The days that followed the great storm were the kind that made Grace Turner believe in second chances. Her ranch, once battered and silent, now buzzed with life. Children played by the paddocks, neighbors mended fences with easy laughter, and fresh-baked pies seemed to materialize on her kitchen table every afternoon. Star, still thinner than Grace liked, but with a spark in her eyes, grazed quietly under the old oak, her reddish coat gleaming in the gentle sun. Evenings brought a golden calm, the sort that made sorrow feel like a distant, fading dream. But it was the potluck, organized by the townsfolk to celebrate Star's miracle, as Mrs. Halpern had said, that truly marked a turning point for Grace. At first, she was wary of the attention. She'd spent so long hiding from the world, letting grief box her in, that the idea of hosting half the town on her patch of earth felt overwhelming. Yet as the day approached, she noticed she was almost excited. She cleaned the porch, set out folding chairs, and let the kitchen fill with the smells of cornbread, slow-cooked beans, and sweet tea. The air was alive with anticipation and the rare peace that comes from knowing you are no longer alone. On the evening of the potluck, the ranch overflowed with laughter and chatter. Tables sagged under the weight of homemade food. Children chased each other, sometimes pausing to offer Star bits of carrot or to brush her tangled mane. Old men traded stories by the fence, and the women clustered in the shade, admiring the foal that had brought them all together. But as dusk settled and the first stars appeared, the mood shifted. Plates were set aside, voices quieted, and all eyes turned to Grace, who stood near the paddock with Star at her side. She hadn't planned a speech, but the expectant hush around her made words rise up, urgent and trembling, from somewhere deep inside. She took a steadying breath, her hand resting on Star's warm shoulder, and began. "Some of you know parts of my story," she said, her voice wavering but strong. "You know I lost Tom, and then Michael. I thought I'd lost myself too. There were days I didn't want to get out of bed, days when I wished the world would just forget about me. Then, one morning, I found Star, broken, scared, nearly gone, and I realized saving her was the only thing that made sense. She gave me a reason to show up, to fight, even when I was sure I couldn't take another step." The crowd was silent, some people bowing their heads, others wiping away tears. Children sat cross-legged at her feet, Star's muzzle nestled in the crook of Grace's arm. The world felt suspended, held in the fragile balance of her words. Grace continued, her voice low but clear. "Every night, I'd sit in that barn, praying she'd make it to morning. There were times I wanted to give up, when it seemed easier to let go. But every time I showed up for her, she showed up for me too. We carried each other. That's what healing looks like. It's never just one way. It's messy and slow and full of setbacks. But it's possible if you let someone in." A small hand tugged at Grace's jeans. She looked down and saw Emily, one of the neighborhood girls, her eyes wide and searching. "Were you ever scared?" the child asked. Grace knelt beside her, the hush deepening. "All the time, honey. Being scared doesn't mean you stop. It just means you have something worth fighting for." She smiled, ruffling the girl's hair. "You find your reason, and you hold on to it with both hands." Star, sensing the shift, nuzzled Grace's shoulder gently, as if offering comfort of her own. Grace blinked back tears and pressed her forehead to the foal's soft cheek. In that moment, she knew the pain of her past would never fully leave her, but she also knew it no longer had the power to control her. Grace stood, drawing strength from the circle of faces around her. "I want you all to know, I couldn't have done this alone. Every meal, every fence post, every kind word. You helped save us too. I spent so long thinking I had to be strong for everyone else. But sometimes, strength is letting others carry you when you can't walk another step." She paused, letting the lesson sink in. Then she turned to the crowd, voice ringing with conviction. "Healing is a two-way street. You don't have to do it alone. Sometimes, the thing that saves you is the thing you try to save. And sometimes, hope can be reborn, even from heartbreak." There was a collective exhale, a sense that something big and invisible had shifted. Heads nodded, shoulders straightened. People looked at each other differently, their own private hurts briefly exposed, understood, and shared. Grace smiled through her tears, the moment bittersweet. Loyalty isn't just about sticking around when things are good. It's about showing up, again and again, even when there's no guarantee it'll pay off. That's what Star taught me. That's what all of you taught me. Linda Harlow, standing near the edge of the crowd, stepped forward, her posture softer than Grace had ever seen. "You showed us what real loyalty looks like," she said, voice thick with emotion. "Not just to your animals, but to this community." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Grace looked up at the house, its windows glowing with lamplight, and then back at the gathered neighbors. You know, I used to think the world was divided, those who helped and those who looked away. But now I see it's not so simple. Sometimes people just need a little push, a little hope, to remember how to care. The youngest of the teenagers, a shy girl named Maddie, raised her hand. "Can I help here, Miss Grace?" "With the horses, I mean. I want to learn to take care of them, like you did with Star." Grace's heart swelled. She nodded, voice thick. "Of course, Maddie. There's always room for one more set of helping hands." The girl grinned, hope lighting her face, and Grace realized that Star's story was already planting new seeds of kindness in the world. The gathering broke up slowly, neighbors lingering to say thank you, to promise more help, to offer hugs and handshake. The night air was soft, carrying the scent of hay and the promise of rain. But Grace felt lighter than she had in years. She watched Maddie and the other children say goodnight to Star, their voices gentle, their eyes bright with possibility. Alone under the wide Texas sky, Grace reflected on how suffering, for all its sharpness, could forge something strong and beautiful, a lesson she would carry for the rest of her days. Grief was never simple, never gone, but she'd learned to carry it with open hands, letting it shape her into someone capable of both giving and receiving love. Star, once the embodiment of loss, was now the proof of hope reborn. Together, surrounded by a community finally awake to its own capacity for compassion, Grace understood that her greatest lesson wasn't just about saving a life, but about allowing herself to be saved in return. As the lanterns winked out, and the ranch fell silent except for the low hum of crickets and the steady breathing of the foal beside her, Grace knew the road ahead would still hold shadows. But she also knew, beyond a doubt, that she would never have to walk it alone again. Years slipped by on the windswept plains of Texas, each one layering new growth over old scars. The ranch once known as the Turner Place became something different, something more. The battered sign out front was replaced with a polished wooden plaque that read, in bright gold letters, "Star's Hope Sanctuary, for every soul worth saving." People came from all over the county to see the place where a half-wild foal and a grief-stricken woman had rewritten what was possible. Grace Turner's hair, once chestnut, now bore streaks of silver. Her walk was slower, but her eyes had lost none of their clarity. She moved through her days surrounded by a living, breathing legacy. Horses, dogs, even a few goats, and the occasional lost cat, each with their own story of rescue and redemption. Young volunteers bustled through the barn, raking, feeding, laughing, as they swapped tales of the animals in their care. Among them, a confident young woman named Maddie moved with purpose, no longer the shy teenager who had once asked if she could help, but now a leader in her own right. On this particular evening, as the last rays of sun painted the pastures gold and the air shimmered with the promise of summer, Grace gathered the volunteers for a walk through the barn. The place was full of new faces, children from the city, a family who had moved to Cielo Verde after losing their home in a distant flood, and a couple who'd driven 3 hours after hearing about the sanctuary online. There was laughter, the warm nicker of horses, the sound of hope quietly at work. They stopped at a simple gravestone set beneath the oldest oak tree. There, Grace knelt to place a bundle of fresh wildflowers. The stone bore only one word: Star. For a moment, silence reigned. Grace rested her hand on the soft earth, voice gentle as she spoke to the memories drifting on the evening breeze. "You changed me. You changed all of us. Every life you touched is still growing." Maddie joined her, kneeling beside the grave. "Thank you, Miss Grace, for giving me a place to belong, for showing me that broken things aren't the same as lost things." Grace smiled, feeling the ache of time, the joy of renewal. You saved me as much as I ever saved you, Maddie. That's the secret, I think. We don't rescue animals. We rescue each other. A family stood a few paces away, watching. The parents looked tired, weighed down by something Grace recognized all too well. The heaviness of loss, the uncertainty of a new start. Their youngest child, a boy no older than 7, lingered near the fence, watching a nervous young colt pacing in the far paddock. Grace caught his eye and smiled. "Would you like to meet her?" she asked softly. He nodded, hesitant. Maddie offered her hand and led the boy into the paddock, showing him how to move slow, to keep his voice gentle. The colt, ears flicking with anxiety, shied at first, but Maddie murmured quietly, the way Grace had once done for Star. The boy reached out, trembling, and the horse, after a long, uncertain moment, nuzzled his palm. Grace watched the moment unfold, heart full. Here in this quiet act was everything she'd learned, that compassion, once set in motion, never truly stops. It ripples outward, child to horse, volunteer to friend, stranger to stranger, building something bigger than any one person's pain. As twilight deepened, Grace gathered everyone in front of the barn, her voice strong with purpose. Star's Hope Sanctuary didn't start as a sanctuary. It started as one soul in need, and one stubborn woman who couldn't look away. I thought I was saving her, but really, she was saving me. And every time one of you shows up to help, every time you choose kindness over comfort, or give a second chance to someone who's been hurt, you carry that legacy forward. She looked around, seeing tears in some eyes, nods in others. Compassion is contagious. It doesn't just heal the one you help. It changes everyone who sees it, everyone who takes part, no matter how small the act. That's what builds a legacy. Not what you lose, but what you choose to love and nurture after the world's tried to convince you to give up. There was a hush, the kind of silence that makes you realize something important has just settled into your bones. Grace continued, "This place stands because of 100 little miracles, and every one of you is part of that. If you ever see someone, animal or human, who needs help, don't turn away. Your choice to care can echo for generations. Be the reason someone believes in miracles again." Maddie stepped forward, her voice steady. "We have room for more volunteers, more animals. We have more stories to write." A wave of applause broke out, and laughter rose with the first stars. Children ran to the pastures, dogs barked playfully, and for a moment, it felt like all the broken pieces of the world had fit together in this one golden place. Later, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, Grace walked alone to the paddock fence, watching the new colt run and stumble, watched by the shy boy who had already begun to smile. She closed her eyes, letting the night sounds wash over her, the crickets, the low whinny of horses, the faint music from the barn. She spoke aloud, not sure if she was talking to Star, to Tom, or to the universe. "We did it. Not just me. Not just you. All of us. Every hand that reached out. Every voice that refused to give up." As she turned to head back toward the warm glow of the house and the waiting voices, Grace felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Loss would never leave her entirely, but it no longer defined her. Love did, and love, she knew, would go on long after she was gone. In the final image, the one that would stay with anyone who'd ever heard their story, the camera panned over Star's Hope Sanctuary at sunset. Children laughing, animals grazing, families healed and healing. A woman with silver hair walking among them all. There was no grand monument, no parade, no easy answers. Just the proof, quietly thriving, that one act of courage, repeated by many hands, could change the world one life at a time. And so the legend lived on, not as a tale of loss, but as a movement of compassion. Grace's words echoed in the evening air, calling out to anyone who needed to hear them. If you see a soul in need, don't turn away. Be the miracle. Let the legacy of love begin with you.